Now, just a few questions about the political system. In elections, you sometimes suggest voting for people who you simultaneously have devastating criticisms of as a lesser evil, as something that is the best one can do in the short term. But then there's also the problem of trying to build long-term institutions of resistance, including within the electoral arena, say, for instance, a third party. So the question is, how do you weigh the benefits? How, in your own mind, how do you weigh the benefits of supporting a liberal corporate candidate who's much better than the other, as against supporting a third-party candidate or a process that is completely independent of that dynamic, to make your choice? I mean, what is it that's going through your head when you come up with that decision?
I don't think there's any formula. It depends on particular circumstances. Like, take, say, 2008. I happen to live in Massachusetts, so safe state. You know how it's going to turn out. So I felt free to vote for the Green Party, which at least is making some kind of effort, whatever one thinks about it, to develop a lasting alternative. If I was in a swing state, say Pennsylvania, I probably would have voted for Obama, because I think it would have been very dangerous in the short term to have McCain and Palin in there. Not that I like Obama, I think there's not enough to say, but other times I just haven't, just kept away from it, didn't see any point in voting at all. Sometimes there's a point, sometimes there isn't, depends on the options, the alternatives. So for example, if Gore had been elected in 2000, it's not obvious that we would have gone to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. We might have, but it's not so clear. If McCain had been elected in 2008, we wouldn't just have a majority ultra-right in the court. We'd have an unbreakable majority.
So there are
many choices like that. First of all, it's not a high-level decision. I think it's like a 10th-rate decision.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah, so other things are way more important. But, if you want the 10 minutes that you're going to spend on this decision, I think there are a lot of, options to consider. I mean, the United States is just not a functioning democracy. But in a functioning democracy, which do exist, I mean, Bolivia, for example, people vote, but that's just a break in an ongoing struggle. So, you vote and you go back to what you were doing. In the United States, the way the thing is set up is there's not supposed to be any participation. You just, big hoopla about the vote, signs all over the place, work on getting out the vote, and you push the lever, and you go home. Well, that's a serious failure of democracy, so you want to try to overcome that democratic deficit, as it's sometimes called, the lack of functioning democracy. It's pretty striking how it's been achieved in the United States. In fact, the very concept of democracy is almost non-existent. So take, say, primaries. I mean, let's imagine you had a functioning democracy with our own institutions. I mean, our institutions, they could be democratic. It's not that they're inherently undemocratic. Political institutions. You have, say, the New Hampshire primary. In a democratic society, what would happen is the people in a town in New Hampshire would get together in their own organizations, assemblies, groups, whatever they are, and take off a little time from whatever political and other activities they're engaged in, and say, okay, let's work out what we would like to see in the next election. And they'd come up with some sort of program. We'd like to see this. Then if some candidate says, I would like to come to town to talk to you, they would say, well, you can come if you want to listen to us. And the candidate could come and they would explain to him what they want, and then they would say, if you can give a convincing reason why you'll support these things, we'll consider voting for you. Or maybe we'll have our own representative, we don't care about you. And that would be a functioning democracy. And what happens is totally different. Nobody meets in the town. The candidate and his PR representatives and so on announce that he's coming to, or she sometimes is coming to a town in New Hampshire, and they kind of gather people together, and the people sit there and listen to the candidate saying how wonderful I am, and I'm going to do all these great things, and nobody believes a word, and then they go home. Well, that's the opposite of democracy. And in fact, we see it all the time. I mean, take, say, April 15th. I mean, in a functioning democratic society, that would be a day of celebration, the day you hand in your taxes. You would be saying, okay, we got together, we worked out some plans and programs that we think ought to be implemented, and we're now participating and providing the funding to get these things done. That's a democracy. In the United States, it's a day of mourning. It's a day when this alien force, the government, which comes from Mars or somewhere, is arriving to steal from us our hard-earned money and use it for their own purposes, whatever they are. That's a reflection of the fact that the concept of democracy is kind of like not even in people's minds. Now, I'm kind of exaggerating. It's not quite this sharp, but it's pretty close. It's a very great success.
You could discuss in a similar fashion the voter turnout, or the reasons why people vote for who they vote for. So voter turnout, what do you think?
Take voter turnout. I mean, there's a lot of effort to get voter turnout. And people go for all kinds of reasons. I mean, sometimes the reasons are quite interesting. Like there was an election in, which people regard as having a startling result in Massachusetts in January, Senate election, which gave the Republicans what's called the 41st seat. Well, that concept alone is interesting. There's two formal political parties in the country, Democrat and Republican. The Republicans have lost any pretense almost of being a traditional political party. They have almost no policies. I mean, the policy is no to whatever you produce. They're kind of like the old Communist Party in that party discipline is almost unanimous. Almost everything is unanimous. They happen to have, 40 votes they had, now they have 41. Almost invariably unanimous. Doesn't matter what the issue is. Maybe appointing somebody to some post in the bureaucracy so it can function. The Democrats, who are kind of, there are groups called moderate Democrats. They're pretty much the ones who used to be called liberal Republicans. The party alignment has shifted so that the liberal Republicans in the traditional usage have been essentially expelled from the party. And they've switched over and become what are called moderate Democrats, meaning Republican, old-fashioned Republicans. So the moderate Democrats sort of go along with the Republicans on all sorts of things. And then there are the Democrats that are called left, almost entirely kind of centrist, pro-business Democrats, a couple of stragglers. Now they've all agreed to require a supermajority on everything. That means the majority rule can be blocked and is blocked if unless you have a supermajority. And the technique that's used is the filibuster. Well, the filibuster had been around for a long time, was occasionally used. It's now, the filibuster has now become kind of like the signing statements. I mean, they had existed in the past. The signing statements are when a president says, okay, I'll sign this legislation, but I'm not going to follow it for this and that reason. There had been such cases, but with Bush II, it became something totally novel. I think there were more signing statements than in the preceding 42 presidencies. It just became routine, and Obama's picking it up. And the filibusters become the same. It's just a way to, for this party discipline, party of no, to insist on a supermajority for anything. In fact, it got to the point where one Republican Senator, Shelby, just announced he's going to hold up every presidential nomination, I think 70 nominations, routine nominations. And of course, he asked for some special gift for his state. Meanwhile, they're saying out of the other side of their mouths, we don't like pork. But unless you give me this gift, I'm going to hold up every nomination. And that works with a party that keeps the party discipline. You know, so. Okay, so Brown, the guy elected in Massachusetts, he was the 41st vote. It means even a supermajority won't work. Now, the vote has been, it was described as being, you know, kind of like a popular rebellion against the government, the leftist government taking over. That's not what happened. What happened was quite interesting. First of all, a flood of money poured in toward the end from the financial institutions. And that's for the reason we already discussed. Obama had started making some mild noises about greedy bankers and so on, and part of the reaction was to say, okay, you talk like that, we're going to eliminate your supermajority. So money, a lot of money poured in. If you look at the voting, which was, you know, the data were published within a couple of days, Brown, the Republican, won primarily for two reasons. The affluent suburbs, were very much engaged and very supportive of Brown. So they're condemning Obama because although he's giving him a lot, he's not giving him enough. So we want even more. That's the affluent suburbs. The urban areas, which are mostly Democratic, you know, working class, poor, voting was very low. And they were essentially telling Obama, you're giving everything away. We don't even want to bother with you. We're not even going to take part. Particularly interesting was the union vote. It was lower than usual, but the majority of the union vote went to Brown. And it's been discussed in the labor press, the good labor press, like Labor Notes, you know, they interviewed people and union leaders and so on. The working people were just furious about the health care program. Now, you know, it's portrayed as a critique of the health care program. In fact, people don't like the health care program, but because it doesn't go far enough, like considerable majorities of the general population, certainly Obama voters even more, were in favor of a public option, Medicare buy-in, other things which Obama just canned. So they don't like it because it didn't go far enough. That's the majority of the population, not exactly what the headlines say. But in the case of the union leaders, activists, working people in unions, they were furious because Obama has been willing to give up everything, practically, except for one thing on which he's been insistent, namely taxing them for their health care plans. It's called it's called an excise tax on Cadillac plans. I mean, the Cadillac plans are not what rich people get. It's what working people have succeeded in eking out of their employers through the union in trade-off for giving everything else away. So part of the trade-off in the class war is in the unions, and this is a bad error of the unions from way back, is to give up on almost everything, but at least to get some benefits for your own people, not for others, just for your own. It's one of the reasons we don't have a national health care program is because of the focus of the unions on ourselves, not others, like very different from Canada, same unions. But in Canada, the same unions insisted on health care for everybody. In the United States, they kind of bought into the corporate system and said, okay, health care for us. The result is that unionized workers get pretty decent, you know, by U.S. standards, pretty decent health care plans. Okay, Obama wants to, and the thing he insists on, he'll give away everything else, he insists on taxing them pretty heavily. So, of course, union workers are furious. So they voted for Brown. They're shooting themselves in the foot. But, yeah, but the voting is understandable.
But you can't, I mean, the blame for the irony, so to speak, really is the real left. I mean, the anger is justified.
Oh, the anger is very justified.
The willingness to sort of rebel and get upset is justified. It's perfectly sensible. There's just no avenue that does anything except make it worse.
Yeah, and that generalizes over the country.
Yeah.
So, you know, I've been saying for some time, and other people have too, it's a serious mistake for the left to make fun of the Tea Party movement and Sarah Palin and the rest of them. I mean, it's easy to make fun of them. A lot of it's just kind of comical and ridiculous. But that's not the point. What we should be doing is ridiculing ourselves.
Not having a better alternative.
I mean, these are people who ought to be organized by the left. Most, there's all kind of groups, like there's militias and black helicopters and so on. But I think at the core of it, it's just legitimate grievances. These are people who've worked hard all their lives, done everything they're supposed to. Their lives they're being shafted. They have been for 30 years. Wages have stagnated, declined. Services are collapsing. They never were very good. Schools are lousy. What's happening to us? Why is this happening to me? Well, they get an answer from, say, Glenn Beck. The rich liberals are taking over everything. They don't care about you, and they want to give it away to illegal immigrants, and so on and so forth. All right, that's a coherent answer. When you listen to them, it's an internally coherent answer. It says something. So, okay, they accept it. The liberal Democrats aren't going to give them an answer. They're going to say, this is happening to you because for the last 30 years we've been working with the corporate system to deindustrialize society and enrich bankers and so on. We're not going to hear that. And the left is just not telling them anything, or it's trying to, but it's not doing it. Now, that's extremely dangerous. It kind of has a whiff of the late Weimar Republic to it. And so ridiculing it doesn't make sense. So it's like the union workers in Massachusetts shooting themselves in the foot, as became clear right away. I mean, as soon as Brown was elected, he managed to get in super fast with the help of the so-called moderate Democrats in time to help vote down an appointment for the National Labor Relations Board, which is the one pro-union, relatively pro-union appointment that was likely to get into the NLRB. NLRB since Reagan has just been, it used to be at one point some device for supporting workers' rights, and it's almost eliminated. But if you eliminate, the last pro-union person, it gets worse. So when they were voting for Brown, that's in fact what they were voting for, but that wasn't what was in their minds. What was in their minds was anger at Obama for insisting on one thing, namely taking away their health benefits.
But if you go back to the late 60s and you come all the way forward, we're talking 40 years. In those 40 years, there's been a left, there's been leftists, there's been people who are critical of all these things that you're talking about, and yet they, if we are honest about it, haven't produced an awareness or a mechanism or pretty much anything that speaks to the broad population, even at a moment when it is furious and it is irate at the government, at employers, at Wall Street, and so on and so forth. So either we've been doing something wrong or it's hopeless. I mean, if we've been doing everything right and gotten to the place where we are, that's not a very good sign. It would be much better if we've made mistakes, if we have failed to operate as well as we should have, and therefore there's things that can be done. So the question arises, in trying to improve the political system, and also in trying to just raise political consciousness and therefore activism in broad populations, what do you think should have been done that hasn't been done in these domains, or shouldn't have been done that was done? In other words, what mistakes or what failings do you think are responsible for the mess that we're in?
Well, the left, such as it is, does talk about these issues, but it's, the left is just a conglomeration of a lot of people. Count noses, it's a lot of people, but very scattered and issue-oriented. So there's a part of the left that's dedicated to gay rights. There's another part that's dedicated to environmental issues. There's another part that's concerned with nuclear weapons, aggression or whatever it may be. There's a whole lot of issues, but they tend to be kind of separated. You can't really identify an organized left that's addressing the kinds of concerns that the general population very rightly has. So what part of the left has been talking constantly, clearly to the right people about the fact that financialization of the economy from the 70s has led to some stagnation, basically, of real wages and incomes, and deterioration of limited benefits and so on. In fact, a large part of the issue-oriented left, unfortunately, has alienated this population. I mean, we may not like it, but the fact is that a large part of that population is racist, is sexist, you know, opposed to gay rights and so on. And while working on those issues is correct, it's got to be done in a way which recognizes the reality of the audience that is out there.
All right, moving on to one of those areas, race in America, racism. You've already talked about it to a certain extent. What is race? What is race and racism? I mean, it's just, what is it?
Well, we know what it is. I mean, it's, first of all, you know, race is, I mean, here, the postmodernists are sort of right. It's a social construction. We decide that there's different races. You can, a lot of different ways you could categorize people. We do it by, you know, color or hairstyle or whatever it is. And it's a deep strain in American history, you know. Goes right back, I've talked about it, goes right back to slavery, never really changed. But it's real. And it shows up very strikingly in people's attitudes. People's attitudes are quite different from what is usually claimed. There's one of the things that political scientists do pretty well is study popular attitudes in extensive polling. And they publish straight and interesting results. Actually, the current issue of the main political science journal, Political Science Quarterly, happens to have an article reviewing a lot of poll studies on attitudes towards social justice issues. And the results are pretty interesting. I mean, it turns out that, contrary to what is commonly claimed, the population is basically kind of social democratic in their attitudes. And in fact, the most interesting part is the author identifies the people who call themselves anti-government, you know, right-wing libertarian, get the government off our backs, that kind of thing. So just looking at their attitudes, they tend to be in favor of more aid for more federal spending for education, for health, for helping poor people, you know, for Social Security. You know, they're pretty much the same things that liberals would say. But there's an exception, two exceptions. They think we're giving too much to blacks, and we're giving too much to people on welfare. Well, it's like it has no relation to reality, but we can see where it comes from. It comes from unremitting propaganda that's based on traditional racism. You know, the blacks are getting everything, they're taking our country away from us. And on this sort of Reaganite type, extremist propaganda about the welfare, you know, the black mother and her Cadillac coming to steal your money at the welfare office. All right, you have enough propaganda like that, and you get this split in attitudes. Now notice I'm talking here about the people who regard themselves as anti-government, you know, right-wing. The general population, it's similar, but less striking in a way. And that shows up on other things too. Actually, when you ask people, they didn't happen to in these polls, but it's been done before, what do you think you ought to give to, say, poor mothers with dependent children?
Of course, it's more than we actually
do. It's way more than we actually do. That shows up on foreign aid too, regularly. You ask people, what do you think about foreign aid? They say we're giving everything away to those undeserving people who are ripping us off. Now, what do you think we ought to give them? Like maybe 10 times as much as we do. You know, so and these are failures of the left too. You know, you're supposed to educate people. But what I think it means is that the audience is there. You know, people's general attitudes are kind of more or less social democratic.
Okay, what about in parallel questions of sexism?
It plays a big role, and there's it's one of the real achievements of the 60s, actually the post-60s movements. I mean, issues were raised in the 60s in an interesting way. I mean, a lot of people know way more about this than I do, but from what I could see, a lot of I think the feminist movement really took off in the 70s and later, and part of it, at least, was a result of sexism in the left. Yeah. I mean, you know, I remember from the resistance movement, it was very striking. You know, the women were supposed to, you know, write hand out the leaflets and so on. In fact, it was even ultra-sexist in some cases. And the men, the resistors, were doing something difficult and dangerous and courageous. And at one point, by the end of it, they were kind of being told, look, you guys are oppressors. And that was very hard for a lot of people to take. I mean, it led to real breakdowns. Here we are, courageous, moral, doing something really hard, and it turns out we're oppressors. It was psychologically quite difficult. But I think out of that came at least one strain of what became the feminist movement. There were others. And it took off. And there have been a lot of changes. I mean, there's a lot of problems, but the country's very different from what it was in the 1960s in this respect. I mean, you can see it at places like, say, MIT. I mean, like when I got there in the 50s, MIT was white males, you know, well-dressed, deferential, you know, working on their, whatever it was, particular professional concerns. If you walk down the halls now, it's half women, maybe a third minorities, informal dress, informal relations, a lot of activism, very scattered like everywhere, but, you know, booths here and there doing this, that, and the other thing. Okay, those are changes.
We've already done some ecology stuff. Do you believe global warming is occurring, largely human-made and susceptible to human correction? I have to ask the question because, of course, there's a growing number of people who would say no.
I don't have any particular technical expertise, but I don't see the slightest reason to doubt the evidence that's been presented or to question the overwhelming consensus of scientists. It's just, so yeah, I take it for granted, and that it's anthropogenic in substantial measure.
Then we have the follow-up, pretty obvious question. How do you understand the seeming willingness of government and of those people who are in position to actually, by virtue of their own activity, affect what goes on in the world, rich, powerful people, to just permit the likely calamity, or at least watch it occur?
My feeling is that, say, CEOs of corporations like ExxonMobil or General Electric or whatever, they have about the same beliefs as, you know, college professors on most things. So yeah, they know it's happening, and they don't really question it. And there is a kind of a standard answer, which is not totally false, that they're concentrated on more short-term problems. So yes, they have to make sure the bottom line is good enough next quarter, or else they lose their salaries and that sort of thing. That part is true, but it doesn't go deeply enough. You go deeper, it gets back to what we were talking about before. This is part of a market economy. I mean, we don't really have a market economy. It's kind of like a quasi-market economy. But there are market elements in the economy. And among those market elements is you simply have to pursue short-term interests, or else you're out. Somebody else will pursue them. I mean, like, suppose there are, say, 3 car companies, you know, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, let's say. Let's imagine they're comparable. And suppose one of them, say GM, says, okay, I'm going to devote resources to making better cars 10 years from now. Okay, they're not going to be around 10 years from now. That's the way market systems work. To the extent that there is limited competition, as there is, you are compelled to focus on short-term gain and advantage over others, or else you're just out of the game. In fact, in the U.S. legal system, it's a legal requirement for the CEOs. So yeah, as part of the quasi-market system we have, You're just going to have to avoid these things. And economists have a word for it. It's called externalities, which you sort of put in a footnote. And it's true of every transaction.
Oh, it's also, I mean, the more extreme version is I'm going to pay it, meaning the head of whatever it is, General Motors, I'm going to pay attention to the fact that what we do influences global warming. That's paying attention to something that affects everybody else. My profits go down, I'm out of business. No, I can't do that.
In fact, I mean, the financial crisis is a perfectly good example. Like,
I could want to do that and not do that.
But if I do that, I'm out. I mean, like, take, say, the financial crisis. I mean, now the big economists talk constantly about systemic risk. We didn't pay enough attention to systemic risk. Yeah, of course not. You can't. And in fact, this was pointed out years ago. I mean, like 10 years ago, two pretty well-known economists, John Eatwell and Lance Taylor, wrote a book called Global Finance at Risk. And basically what they pointed out is that because systemic risk isn't considered, it's an externality, there's got to be a catastrophe. I mean, that means you're underpricing risk. There's more of it than you should take. And so, yes, of course, it'll crash. And then there's other factors like perverse incentives and so on and so forth. But it's just like built into the system. Yes, if, say, you and I make a transaction, maybe you sell me a car or something, I mean, if we got our brains functioning, we'll try to make a good deal for ourselves. But we're not paying attention to the effect on somebody else, like congestion and pollution and gas prices going up.
The system,
that's not the nature
unless
of
the system includes that, which markets don't.
One of the very well-known inefficiencies of markets, like every student learns it in freshman course, and then you forget about it.
This explains why the CEO, the powerful people in the economy, regardless of their desires, personal desires, they may be horrified by global warming, can't do anything to deal with it. But there's something, or can't do anything in that domain. And
what they do is interesting. Like take British Petroleum, which is considered, very progressive in this respect. What they're trying to do is to buy into the alternative technology market, figuring, okay, that's going to be a profitable market, so we'll work on solar collectors. And so.
There is one other avenue. So take, for instance, a company that years back has somebody at the head of it who's anti-racist. He can't, in fact, hire blacks in the United States at a higher rate than they're getting because, once again, he's now depressing his. So even though he desires to do it, the market prevents him from doing it because other people won't do it and he'll be outcompeted. But the government could then pass a law saying you have to.
So what they'll do is move their production to Mexico and then to China and so on. But there's actually pretty interesting study. I mean, Tom Ferguson's work, which is some of the best work I know on political economy. For example, he did a lot of studies on the New Deal. And it's something that shows up elsewhere too. What he found is that during the New Deal, Roosevelt and the New Deals were getting pretty good support from a particular sector of industry, high-tech, internationally oriented industry, like Swope, head of GE, was quite strongly New Deal. On the other hand, they were passionately opposed by low-tech, labor-intensive, domestically oriented industry. And it's for just this reason. Say for General Electric, capital-intensive, okay, they want a disciplined workforce. They don't want disrupted. And it's not a big expense for them, so okay, we'll have unions. They're internationally oriented, so they wanted the export promotion policies of the New Deal. For manufacturing industry, it's quite the opposite. Labor costs make a big difference. They don't want the labor force unionized. They don't care much about international trade. So you get this difference of political support.
But we still come back to the government, because the government is slightly different. Not to say there aren't constraints on it, but it is still slightly different. And I could certainly imagine, maybe it's naive, but I could certainly imagine a president, Obama, or others, it doesn't matter who, McCain, anybody, marshaling the office, the bully pulpit, and everything else to scare the bejesus out of the country on global warming. You might not, in other words, that might be manipulative, et cetera, but you can imagine them doing it. And you could imagine, as a result, a powerful upsurge, which would then create a context in which corporations are, sort of the market dynamic is overwhelmed, and you get some results. But they don't seem to be doing it.
Well, it did happen. Take, say, Al Gore.
He tried.
He tried, and he was smashed. He became denounced as a liberal elitist, out of touch. He takes jet planes. The point is, there are always strong counterforces, and defamation is one of the easiest things to do. You can make up lies as much as you want, and you can make people look ridiculous and so on. If you have enough clout, so okay, that's what happened. Yeah, it could have worked, but it would require a lot of popular organization. Actually, Roosevelt did it to a limited extent, but he did it. But he had a mass popular movement behind him. The labor movement really did organize, and there were plenty of other movements. The country became pretty radical. So yeah, he had a basis for going after the bankers and so on, and instituting some reasonable legislation. Glass-Steagall, Social Security, Wagner Act, and others. Not trivial.
Right, it's a offshoot question. You're not a vegetarian, right? Do you think there's a moral case for vegetarianism, and do you think it might emerge?
I think there's a moral case for it, and a ton of letters that come to me about it. But there's a moral case for a lot of things. Like there's a moral case for the fact that if you look at deaths from starvation, human deaths, among children, forget everyone else, among children alone, deaths from starvation or starvation-related diseases are about twice the level of Rwanda. Not 100 days, but every day. Okay, that's a problem. Now, you can say, well, let's deal with both, and mention 1,000 other problems. Let's deal with them all. Well, time and energy happen to be finite, which means you have to pick and choose. You can't do everything. It's out of the question. So you have to set priorities. And say, in this case, suppose I have a choice between devoting I could pick 20 other cases, but let's pick this one. Suppose you have a choice between devoting energy and effort to writing books about and giving talks about and so on, trying to save the children, which is pennies a day, there's nothing to it, very little effort, to save to stop the double Rwanda-style killing among children every day. And there's a choice between that and essentially carrying out mass genocide of domesticated animals, because that's what vegetarianism means. It's an effort to reduce animal suffering. But the fact of the matter is that, suppose we all became vegetarians, the first thing you'd have to do is eliminate almost all domesticated animals, because they're raised to eat, for eating meat. That's why we have cows, chickens, sheep, and so on and so forth. So somehow you've got to get rid of them. You can't just let them reproduce and proliferate, or first of all, they'll starve to death if you don't feed them, so it'll be genocide anyway. So there is a big, and that's one of the immediate consequences of vegetarianism. You can pretend I don't notice, but it is. So okay, these are things to balance.
Does the fact that a significant number of seemingly and presumably really well-meaning, caring, sensitive people put huge amounts of time into concerns around animals and not into concerns about humans strike you as one more indication of the failure of the left, because they basically feel maybe we can succeed on this front, this front's hopeless.
They can't succeed on that front.
Yeah, but they think that.
No, look, I don't want to criticize particular people. Actually, my own children, for example.
Vegetarian?
One of them's vegetarian, the other's semi-vegetarian. Okay, they made their choices. That's fine choices. Respect it. They do other things which are great, And people can make those choices, and maybe a sensible choice in their own lives. Maybe they can spend time.
I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about people who are animal rights activists, who are devoting time and energy and organizing to that.
Their priorities, I said, my priorities, we all have to do that. I think we can understand each other's reasoning. We may have different judgments about how priorities ought to be ranked.
Another thing that you will encounter as an organizer is the person who will feel that the deck is stacked, that it's just that what you do has no efficacy. It has no possibility of succeeding, and they will again try to argue from history, saying, "Well, look, there's crime, there's torture, there's poverty, there's recycled forms of oppression. No matter what you do, it's like rolling a rock up a hill. Eventually, it's going to come down and crush you. So why bother?" And that's what a great many people who will say, who will be honest enough to admit, okay, the situation is oppressive, okay, people maybe are capable of something more, but City Hall's too strong to fight, you know, the state's too strong. How do you deal with that?
History doesn't tell you that. What history tells you is that a lot of things have been overcome. It wasn't easy, it wasn't complete, there's always problems, there's regression, but lots of things that were considered entirely acceptable not long ago are considered totally outrageous now. Well, we can run through the list, but it's pretty easy. Now, if you want to say suppose somebody comes back and argues and say, well, now it's different, it's much harsher. Well, that's plainly untrue. It's much easier now. The forces of repression that exist now are nothing like what they were in the past. We have a legacy from people who have struggled to make things better, and we're a lot more free. We're more free, we've got a lot more opportunities. State repression exists, other kinds of repression exist, but nothing like in the past. It's extremely unlikely now that, say, the government could carry out anything like, say, Wilson's Red Scare, or even COINTELPRO, which is not that far back. I mean, they can do things, but they've lost the ability to use force. And we know it, and they know it. That's, in fact, one of the main reasons for the development of the public relations industry and modern systems of propaganda. Systems of power knew and recognized and, in fact, said, or say a century ago, that they are, mostly in the more free countries, like England and the United States, that they have essentially lost the capacity to control people by violence. So therefore they'll control them in other ways. Actually, that even shows up in the, and the other ways to do it is by controlling opinion and attitude. So huge industries developed to do that. Actually, it even shows up in just the financial institutions. You take, say, a standard academic history of financial institutions. Barry Eichengreen, one of the main economists, economic historians, he's very straight about it. He says, of course, market systems impose, if they're let to run free, in financial market systems, they're going to impose tremendous burdens on people. A lot of people. They're just going to suffer badly, crashes and so on. But in the 19th century, this wasn't much of a problem because they couldn't do anything about it. But then he goes on to say, with the increase in, I think he calls it politicization of the masses, forming of parliamentary labor parties and unions and so on and so forth, it became harder to impose on the population the costs of market systems. So after the Second World War, when a new global system was set up, the Bretton Woods system, Keynes and Harry Dexter White, what they did was institute control over capital movement, and control over speculation, fixing currencies. They introduced them as a way of compensating for the inability to distribute the costs of market systems to the public. This reduced the costs, and it did. That's why we had a couple of decades of huge growth, and equitable growth, and so on. It was very straight. There happens to be a corollary that he didn't add, but you can add, and that is with the breakdown of this system in the 1970s, with the financialization of the economy, you're getting the costs of financial markets distributed over the public again, and something's going to have to be done about it. But yeah, that's a lot of thinking goes into this, and it shows there's a lot of results.